doctrinal preaching. Hey guys, I thought I could, as we kind of prepare for tomorrow, as we prepare for the Lord's Day, I thought that I could bring you guys kind of into my study as I just finished putting some kind of final touches on the second sermon for tomorrow, and I really just kind of wanted to bring you guys into my study process to see what that looks like. It's not perfect by any means. I don't want you to use me as your only example or whatever. I think there are many great resources out there. I just kind of wanted to show you where I am now, my setup, and I kind of will do. I'll bring my screen up and I'll show that to you guys. Basically, it's my conviction that preaching really consists of. Preaching is not just exegesis. It's not just exposition of the text. Okay, preaching it's much more than that. It does entail exposition and exegesis. Without exegesis, you can't preach rightly. You can't discern the word rightly. You can't divide the word rightly. You can't make the word plain to the congregation without exegesis. So don't hear me as saying exegesis doesn't matter or exposition doesn't matter. We're not supposed to do expositional preaching. That's not what I'm saying. In fact, expositional preaching is absolutely crucial. I think the scriptures even give us examples of expositional preaching, and I think that's the example that we should follow. So don't hear me as saying that exposition isn't important, but kind of let's use for a moment a distinction in our theology. We make a distinction between biblical theology and systematic theology, right? And you think of biblical theology as kind of tying the scriptures together, looking at kind of the redemptive, historical, overarching purpose of God in the scriptures, and exposing that, through things like exegesis, and then from that we derive various doctrinal conclusions having to do with the doctrine of the scriptures, the doctrine of God, the doctrine of Christ, right? And so we take our biblical theology, we organize it into a systematic, kind of logical system that is Christian systematic theology. And so you might think of that relationship when it comes to exposition, and then expositional preaching, and then doctrinal preaching. And then you think of biblical theology, systematic theology, or you might even use dogmatics. Biblical theology, systematic theology, and then practical theology. Okay, so there are three things really that should go into preaching, and there's much more than this, but just hear me out for a second. There's basically three things that I'm convinced need to make up a sermon, and this is going to look different for different pastors and how they go about formulating their outlines and their manuscripts and so on and so forth. But basically, there needs to be three things, and that needs to be exposition of the text, the doctrine that flows out of that exposition, and then the application. So exposition or exegesis, the exegetical part, the doctrinal part, and the applicational part, or the useful part, the practical part, right? And if you guys are familiar with Peter Van Mastricht's way of doing theology, and in the first volume that was published by Reformation Heritage Books not too long ago, the first volume, he actually lays out this kind of paradigm for preaching. The only part that I'm leaving out that he included is the elenctic part, which is kind of responding to objections and things like that. And that there's a place for that as well in preaching, and I don't have a specific section in my outline for affirmations and denials. It kind of happens throughout. If there's a particular issue going on, or even historically, if there was an issue that relates to this text, or a twisting of this text that has become apparent, I'll address that in the doctrinal part. I still think we should respond to objections. I just don't make it personally. I don't make it a separate part within my outline to do that. And if you do, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine. But I do think it's important to respond to objections. It's just not officially kind of brought out in my outline, if you know what I mean. And so that's it. Exegesis, doctrine, application. Exegesis, doctrine, application. Now, I was doing for a while. I was doing it to where the application wouldn't be clearly marked out, but it would be throughout my sermon outline. There'd be application, bits of application, kind of throughout the text. And I still think application should be throughout the manuscript or your outline. Throughout the sermon, application should be made. I did it for a while where I had application at the very, very end, and that's fine. I understand that, but I think it's helpful for the congregation to make application throughout the sermon. That way, they don't have trouble connecting the dots between the application and the exegesis and the dogma or the doctrine. When you get to it at the very end of the sermon, it might be harder for them to recall what happened at the beginning of the sermon. So to have that application kind of happening throughout the sermon, I think is helpful for the congregation. And so here I'll bring you onto my screen here, and the only thing I don't like is that this. Hold on, I'll get rid of that. I don't have my other screen up right now, which I wish I did. Because then I could just put this. Then I could just put this somewhere else. As it is, I'll just kind of do this and trust that I'm recording. So here's my logos kind of up here, over here on the left hand side of the screen, and you see the text. I preach out of the New King James, so I have the text of the New King James down here, and I always use funny colors, but the different colors just represent the different texts that I'm preaching on. So in the morning, I preach on this one here. It's going to be verses 25 and 26. It's the blood of Christ in the cup, the cup of the Lord's Supper. We're in the Lord's Supper right now at Victory. And so in 1 Corinthians 11. And so that'll be the first sermon. That's the text that the first sermon is going to be grounded in. And then the second sermon, which is what I have here pulled up, my manuscript is over here, is going to be on verses 27 through 29. They're right after. So here's my outline, and take it for what you will. I think that this is going to, I've only been preaching weekly since I first began pastoring. Before that, it was kind of hit and miss, a Sunday here and there. But this has really allowed me, this first 5-6 months of pastoring has really allowed me to hone in on kind of what works for me in terms of being better able to communicate to the congregation what needs to be communicated from the text. And so I think outlining is very important. Manuscripting is very important. A good deal of your time should probably go into that if you're a pastor, because you're dealing with, a lot of people will say, well, don't spend too much time on sermon prep, but your time spent on sermon prep is very important, because what you're doing is you're refining the way that you're going to communicate to the congregation, and God uses that, right? God uses your communication to make plain the scriptures to His people, to His sheep, and so that's a very important part of creating your sermon manuscripts or outlines, and so a good deal of time should go into that. I think probably I should spend more time on it. The 2 sermons that we have every Sunday, that I preach every Sunday, those together, I probably spend somewhere around 20 to 30 hours, 25 to 30 hours on both of those manuscripts, not on each one, but on both of them together. Spend 25 to 30 hours out of the week on manuscripting. And that doesn't really include me reading commentaries and things like that. So a great deal of time goes into these, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, because I know some of my previous pastors that have spent more time than that just on one sermon manuscript. So I'm certainly not saying, my point is that it's important for the sake of your people, for the sake of your sheep, for the sake of your congregation, that you spend time on communicating the text well. Okay, this is not something that depends on you alone. This is the Spirit's work, and we should take that very seriously, but we should also understand that the Spirit uses the means of our communication to make plain the scriptures to God's people. So what you have here is is, like any good Baptist, I've divided the sermon into 3 points. We have a lot of note takers at Victory, which is very, very good. I am so blessed that that is the congregation of which I'm a part, who care to take note of the Word of God and then hold what I say up against the Scriptures. And so there's 3 points here: guilt of the body and blood of the Lord. That's Paul's dealing with that in verses 27 through 29. So I'm going to cover, hopefully by God's grace, cover what Paul means by that. The principle of self-examination, and then discernment of the Lord's body. Okay, so I begin with the guilt at the table. That's point 1. Point 2 is self-examination, and point 3 is discerning the Lord's body. And each of these points has their own exegesis. You see that there? Exegesis, the doctrine that flows from the exegesis, and then the application. Okay, so that's how I have each point. Each point is divided up that way. You'll have the exegesis, which is the direct interaction with the text, and then the doctrinal conclusions from that exegesis, and then the application flowing from both the exegesis and the doctrine. And so that application happens for each point. I think most of the time I only have 3 points. I think one time, just to prove to my congregation that I could do more than just 3 points, I had 4 points. I threw everybody off guard that day, kept them on their feet, woke them up. But no, I almost always have 3 points, and I didn't always divide the 3 points up this way. Like, they didn't always have exegesis, doctrine, application. At first, what I was doing was these subheadings where exegesis, doctrine, and application are now would actually be the text itself. And so, but I think what was happening that way, what was happening is that the sermons were almost pure exegesis, and there were no doctrinal conclusions. Well, I say there were no doctrinal conclusions. It would be easier to miss the doctrinal conclusions. And then I had application at the very end, which sometimes there's a gap to bridge there. By the time you get to the end of the sermon, sometimes it's not as easy to connect the dots between the application and the actual exegesis of the text. So I think that this is going to be a better model. I've even noticed in terms of creating the manuscript, it flows a little bit better because okay, here, guilt at the table, I need to squeeze as much out of the text as possible in this section. That's the exegesis. Then in the doctrine, what are the doctrinal conclusions from that exegesis? And then what's the application that flows from our exploration, that flows from our those things, from the exegesis and the doctrine. And so it flows better even in terms of preparation, and it even seems to read in more of a logical manner, one that will be more apprehendable to the congregation, or so I hope and I'm praying for. So that's kind of my manuscript. I'll kind of just get rid of that, and I will I'll bring the logos up, and actually what I'll do here is I'll slam that over there. Oops. And then have this over here. So we'll have, see my Spotify, I was jamming out earlier. Okay, so this is my logos setup. For whatever, if you guys are interested in this kind of thing. This is my logos setup. What I have is up here in this block. I have the NAS. It's a different translation than the one I preach out of. I preach out of the New King James. And I do that because the NAS is notoriously more rigid, more wooden. And so I have that very wooden translation. And the reason I don't preach out of the NAS is because sometimes it's so wooden that I fear it's an excellent translation. But I fear that sometimes in terms of just reading the text to the congregation, some of the word ordering and things like that can it's easy to muddle those sentences, for me when I'm reading it. And so the New King James tends to flow better. But the reason I have both translations up is because The New King James certainly is not a perfect translation, and neither is the NAS. But it helps to have kind of to be able to do a comparative analysis between multiple translations. And in this block, sometimes I'll pull up the ESV. Right now, I have the Septuagint, and I didn't use the Septuagint with the preparation in these two particular sermons here. But the reason I have the Septuagint up is because if Paul or someone in the New Testament makes use of the Old Testament, a lot of the times they're quoting from the Septuagint. So it's helpful to have the Septuagint kind of close at hand, especially when someone like Paul or the other apostles make use of it and quote from it. What I was doing with this most recent, I wasn't even working on one of the sermons. I was looking at all of the times that Israel is referred to as a church in the Old Testament. Israel is referred to as a church actually numerous times in the Old Testament, and the Septuagint bears witness to that. It calls Israel the ecclesia a number of different times. So that just shows that Israel was a lot of the times there's a strict distinction made between Israel and the church, such that Israel can never be the church and the church can never be Israel. But I don't think the Old Testament Jewish mind thought that way, and I don't think the New Testament Jewish mind thought that way in the first century. Israel is described as an ecclesia many, many times. Anyways, that's what I was doing with that. So I didn't want this to be like a super duper long video, and I just kind of thought it would be neat to show you guys kind of what I do. If you guys have any recommendations as far as a better setup, then let me know. I am open to recommendations. If this has helped you, please, after subscribing, I would absolutely love it if you would share this video. And share it on your social media profile. I don't know if you're on Twitter or Facebook, but I certainly am not. So if you could share this after subscribing, press that little red button down there, then I would be really appreciative. Anyways, guys, if this was helpful, again, share it. If not, don't share it, but leave me a comment to tell me how I can do better. God bless you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your day.